I'm very happy to introduce him. It's our guest speaker today, Jacob Sheetz-Willard, joining us all the way from Utah, I think, and has very generously woken up to be here with us. Jacob is a teacher, writer, ultra runner, and wilderness guide. He works at the High Mountain Institute in Colorado, where students balance academic life on campus with multi-day wilderness expeditions. One thing I learned about him is that he finds maps endlessly interesting, and maybe after this talk, we will too. So, Jacob, thank you again for being with us, and the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Ema, and thanks everyone for being here. Pull up my slides. I want to begin by having you imagine a place that you know well, that has significance for you. It should be a physical location, and I want it to be a place that you would say that you love. So as you have that place in mind, imagine that you've been asked to describe it to someone you've just met. What would you say? What words would you use? What would be essential to include, and what would you leave out? How would you go about framing that place? That is, would you start with a close-up, or would you begin kind of from above with a bird's eye view? What image would you want that person to have? Would you begin with a memory, or would you try to be objective? So think about that for a moment. So indeed, I want to tell you about a place that's special to me, about a place that I call home. It's a tiny town in the Rocky Mountains. I saw that in the chat, of the American West, situated right along the eastern edge of the Continental Divide, which means that all the snowmelt on our side, the east side, ends up in the Arkansas River and eventually the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, while all the snow on the other side drains into the Colorado River system and theoretically into the Pacific Ocean, although I'll talk about where some of that water actually goes. So I live about 2 hours southwest of Denver, which is the nearest major airport. There are 2,500 people who live in Leadville, and it's actually the highest city in the United States, sitting in a valley at about 10,000 feet or 3,200 meters, surrounded by mountains on the east and the west. A little history, the first permanent settlements came in the 1860s during the Colorado Gold Rush. But before that, it was an ancestral hunting grounds for the Ute people, the indigenous group that lived there for 10,000 years before white people came. So it's a mining town, one of the world's largest exporters of molybdenum, but it's also an adventure destination. And since the 1980s, it has hosted the Leadville 100, which is one of the original 100-mile running races in the world. So now maybe you have an image in your mind of what I just described, but more likely you're probably thinking that I didn't do a very good job. Is this information useful? In some ways it is. If you know about watersheds or geology, it's useful to know the name of the drainage basins or how the mountains formed. The elevation and population statistics will maybe give you a sense of scale relative to where you live. The historical context is maybe less meaningful to most of you. If I were to guess, I'd bet there are as many ultra runners in this audience as people who know what molybdenum is, which is to say, probably not many. I imagine that for everyone, the place you pictured in your mind based on this description didn't just seem hazy relative to the place in your memory that I asked you to imagine. It probably felt different too. So even if I give you some pictures, here's the camps where I work. So we're right next to Mount Elbert, which is an American peak that you can all now know, which is actually the tallest one in Colorado and the second tallest in the lower 48 states. And here's the town of Leadville in the winter in the valley. So even if I give you these pictures, you still can't really enter the frame of imagination. It's as if I were trying to describe a house by telling you how far apart the walls are, and what kind of glass is in the windows, and where the electrical sockets are placed. That's useful information if you're a contractor, but it can't really compare with actually walking in through the door and feeling the atmosphere. Because that's what I'm trying to get us to communicate is not our knowledge of a place, but what it feels like to live there. We're trying to communicate the quality of the love we have for it. And my contention is that we don't really fall in love with tectonic plates or riparian systems. We fall in love with particular mountains and specific rivers. So, as Ema mentioned, I'm an educator, and for 12 years I've worked at a school in Leadville called the High Mountain Institute, where our core values are all about connecting students with the natural world through place-based experiential education and extended wilderness expeditions. Our classrooms are quite literally the mountains and canyons of the American West. So on campus, I teach literature and writing to teenagers, and in the backcountry, I teach students how to navigate through wild places, to work with each other, to learn from the land. In both contexts, I spend a lot of time thinking about how we know, how we relate to what we don't know, and how we come to love and value what ends up mattering to us. I also spend a lot of time interacting with maps. And what I've learned is that maps are a useful object for revealing how we create and relate to knowledge. And that is going to be my theme this morning. What I'm interested in exploring is not just what the map does, but what it is, what it says and what it doesn't say, what it implies in its relationship to the reality of the territory it's intended to represent. So I'm going to pose some questions and offer some provocations. And ultimately, I want to suggest that direct experience of a landscape, of reality, can be an antidote to too much abstraction in education and in life. So I want to start over by way of introduction with a story. So it's 2015, and I'm with a group of about a dozen educators taking a week-long avalanche education course. We're up on the east side of Leadville in January, below Mosquito Pass, which is an unpaved pass nearly 4,000 meters tall, which looks something like this. Back in the 1800s, before a railroad line, this was actually the standard route into Leadville. So if you can imagine kind of exhausted horses wheezing in the thin air as they pulled carriages over the mountain ridge, these slightly nauseated travelers bucked up and down, the noise of hooves and wooden wheels on unstable rock. In those days, you would have seen a gulch as you were coming down the pass, totally stripped of its timber, littered with mine tailings, full of the smoke of smelters and charcoal kilns. So the remains of those mining camps from the 1880s are still there on Leadville's east side. You actually have to be careful not to fall into a mine shaft when you're running around back there. But as you can see down at the bottom, right, the pine forest has recovered. But the pass is no less precarious than it was in that era. This is what it still looks like. The dirt road is still rutted out and covered in broken talus. There are boulders as big as an infant's head that make any sort of traction basically impossible, even in summer, which is anyway the only time that it's passable on anything besides skis. So needless to say, this hasn't really been the standard route into Leadville for quite some time. So imagine that it's a snowy afternoon in January in the same gulch. We're down at the bottom and we're standing in pits we've dug in the drifts of snow, measuring its depth and assessing the stability of the snowpack. So the road is plowed and drivable in the winter, but only up to the spot where we are, where we were that day. And at that point, the road forks to the left and starts to climb up Mosquito Pass. But right at that point, too, there's this giant snow berm, about a meter tall across the entire road. This is where the plow trucks have pushed and piled the drifted snow as they're clearing the road. So as we're looking at snow crystals under magnifying glasses standing in these pits, a car starts approaching us, coming up the road. It's a champagne-colored Toyota Corolla, essentially a tiny sedan with no clearance and two-wheel drive. And as the car approaches us and the snow berm, the driver slows down. We look at him and he looks at us. And then a half second later, he accelerates directly into the snow, burying the entire front of his car. As we were digging him out a few minutes later, he said that Google Maps had instructed him to take the shortcut over Mosquito Pass. He thought it would save him some time on his way to Denver, and he was confused as to why the road was covered in snow. So I still find this story funny, and it was a memorable one. And the stakes in this situation were thankfully pretty low, right? The damage to the car was probably less than the damage to this guy's ego. But the question the story raises seems even more pertinent now than it did a decade ago. At what point do otherwise useful abstractions like Google Maps start to get us into trouble? How can we stay oriented to our senses and environment in a world increasingly mediated by these digital technologies? What does it mean to relearn to trust ourselves? So when I'm taking a group out into the wilderness, the first lesson always has to do with orientation. Before we put on our packs or take one step down a trail, we have to know exactly where we are. And we do that by looking at the landscape. We begin, as that unfortunate motorist did not, with the evidence of our eyes. We try to find a few points in the immediate environment that can help us determine our location on a map. Maybe that's the edge of a canyon or a ridgeline or a river or a road. If it's morning, the sun can quickly tell us which way is east. Once I mentioned using the sun to orient a map to a student, and a student asked me if the sun coming up in the east was an everyday thing. I assured her that it was, but it got me thinking about how infrequently we actually ask students to engage with physical space. That generally happens after school, on the field, or on the pitch, or else on the weekends. The norm during the school day, at least during the school days I experienced, is a sort of collective confinement in a building where the architectural influence of prisons is certainly not lost on the teenagers that are housed there. Would the average American student who spends 7 or 8 hours staring at the walls of a classroom be able to say which of those walls faced east? I don't think so. So there's an important order of operations to this. I always insist that they start with the landscape before taking out the map, because otherwise there's this enormous temptation to lie to yourself about what you perceive. If you look at the map first, you'll realize where you want to be, and you'll think about how tired you are and how long you've been hiking, how good it will feel to have arrived at your destination. Then you'll look up at the landscape and you'll think, yeah, this seems about right. That ridge kind of fits this set of contour lines. I don't really see a river, but maybe it dried up since the map was printed. So getting lost is what happens whenever we try to make the actual landscape fit the imagined one, whenever abstractions seem more real to us than whatever our senses are taking in. I want to be careful to stress that I'm not anti-map or anti-abstraction. Obviously, I use maps all the time. And humans have been abstracting and conceptualizing and imagining since the Paleolithic period. Notable abstractions include language, money, the nation state, God, Instagram, capitalism, the future, and Schrodinger's cat. Our ability to abstract is what allows us to reason and think. It's how we've been able to develop everything from democracy to poetry to quantum computing. And it's one of the capacities that marks us as human. But it is worth remembering that abstractions are just that, abstract. You can't eat money, and you certainly can't pet Schrodinger's cat. And it's worth noting that, like all products of human culture, our ways of knowing and mapping the world are limited by the choices we make and the questions we ask, like what gets included in our models and what gets left out. What can we see based on the tools that we're using? What's useful and how does it relate to what's real? These are questions of scale and intention and representation. It's important to think about how we make maps, but also how we use our maps. Because we live in this era of unprecedented abstraction, I think it's worth considering those moments when we've mistaken the map for the territory and ended up with our wheels metaphorically buried in a snowbank. And I'll admit at the outset that I'm skeptical of certain forms of knowledge that ignore human experience, that tend to reinforce a distinction between human beings and the world in which we live. I want to emphasize that word form. It's not the knowledge that I'm skeptical of. So much in contemporary research, from physics to biology to earth sciences, has stressed interconnectedness. So this includes research into mycorrhizal networks, the fungal threads connecting root systems underground, making possible the sharing of resources. It includes our evolving understanding of how microbes link living systems at various scales. Even something like quantum entanglement, which suggests that the universe is connected in some fundamental but mysterious and elusive way. So we know that the health of living systems depends on understanding the relationships between the various parts. So why is it so hard to translate that knowledge into how we actually live? How is it we can continue to go about our lives as if we as a species, as individuals, don't also depend on the health of these living systems? My contention is that forms of knowledge matter as much as the content of knowledge. That any form of knowledge that tends to separate mind from body, organism from environment, self from other is limiting because it perpetuates an incomplete view of what the world is, what we are. One task of education in the 21st century, as I see it, is to return us a little bit to our senses, to remind us that we exist in physical space, in relationship with every living thing. To paraphrase the writer Susan Sontag, I think we need an education that makes the world more real rather than less real to us. So I should define what a map is. And I might start by saying that a map is a two-dimensional representation of space, right? It's a way to categorize and define relationships between particular features within that space. But it's also most basically an extension of the human body. And if you think about it, this is true of all the tools that we have. Fire is like a portable metabolism. Written language extends the human voice across distance and time. The telescope and microscope sharpen the eyes. And the internet is kind of like a central nervous system, just less encased in skin. Maps function in the same sort of way. So in representing space, maps externalize memory and knowledge, and they also make these things public. But maps also make claims about significance. To put something on a map, whether a water source or a public road, is to assign it value within the community. It's to say, this exists, this is important, this matters to us. Maps make the world visible, legible, and navigable. But to make one thing visible is also inherently to make other things invisible. Imagine if you were walking out through the darkness on a moonlit night in the mountains or the desert, something I do a lot. You turn on a headlamp or a head torch, and a circle of light at your feet comes into sharp focus. But at the same time, the surrounding darkness deepens in contrast with what's now illuminated. Have you noticed that? Your eyes, which just a moment ago could see the whole landscape, could make out the trees and the rocks and the pools of water, adjust instantly to the brightness of the beam. That dim but expansive sort of awareness you would enjoy just a moment ago is exchanged for a particular point of focus, one with sharply defined edges. The visible world now has a circumference, and it now has a center. So one of the earliest surviving maps that we actually still have is a clay tablet from the 6th century BCE called in Latin the Imago Mundi, the image or representation of the world. It shows the city of Babylon on the Euphrates River, surrounded by the ocean and 8 outlying islands arranged in this sort of triangular pattern around the circle. In the text which remains, one of these regions is described as the place, quote, where one sees nothing. As for what goes on in the interior of these distant triangular regions, the map says simply, quote, no one knows. The world in the chiseling of this map acquires a center. And in marking a circumference around Babylon, the map makers separate the known from what's unknowable. What's also interesting to me in this tablet is the convergence of map making and myth making. So the cuneiform text at the top of the Imago, which you can see here, details a battle between these two Babylonian gods. It's a creation story, an origin myth. The victory of one god and vanquishing of the other marks the beginning of human history and the birth of language. So when this map says you are here, as all maps do, it locates us both spatially and in terms of narrative. The map and the myth make claims about what is culturally important, and they do so overtly. The sea, which encircles Babylon here, divides what's central from what's peripheral, what's sacred from what's profane. This tablet is quite literally a worldview, a view of the world. In his book, A History of the World in 12 Maps, Jerry Broughton argues that maps, quote, offer a proposal of the world rather than just a reflection of it. They extrapolate from systems of belief to aspire to a comprehensive view. So notice the action there, extrapolating from systems of belief. In other words, one map's description of reality is also always a transmission of cultural values. This is as true of a New York City subway map as it is of the Imago Mundi. It's true of the topographical maps we use in the wilderness and also the digital apps that help us stay found in a foreign city. Of course, something like a subway map has a wildly different attitude towards space than the Imago Mundi, or at least it appears to. For one, the older map's cosmology, that is kind of the way it orders value, is made explicit. You are either inside the circle or you are outside of it. And to be inside the circle is to belong to a civilization whose values are articulated in a shared myth that everyone can see right there on the map. We might say of these modern iterations that they're just maps, right? They're meant to be useful and nothing more. And they are useful. But this is a little like the fish who doesn't really know what water is because he's never had a holiday up on the sand. In other words, the invisibility of this map's cultural worldview is not a function of it, but of us. Our proximity to these values is what makes them transparent. No map is ever just a tool. As the fiction writer Peter Turchi says in his book Maps of the Imagination, it's also a visual statement, a way of seeing, one that asserts tremendous authority, which few viewers are likely to question. In accepting the usefulness of a map like this, we also accept the way it orders space and organizes value. Let's consider for just a moment this map of the New York City transit system, the MTA. Like all maps, it makes choices about what's central and what's peripheral. Manhattan, as the cultural and financial hub of the US, is prioritized visually in this map. Brooklyn and Queens exist somewhere out beyond the river's boundary to the east. New Jersey is vaguely alluded to across the Hudson River to the west. The subway lines, which spread out across the city like capillaries in the body also converge into veins and arteries around familiar places. Times Square, Rockefeller Center, Grand Central, Penn Station, Broadway, the places that if you've ever been to New York, you would recognize. The map itself, though, shows no favorites among potential destinations. To render these landmarks and the routes between them visible, the designers of this map first had to make everything else invisible. They had to select and choose, exclude and omit the messiness and extravagance of the actual city, has undergone a radical simplification. It's been visually streamlined on the basis of efficiency, instrumentality. Its attitude towards space is a sort of cool neutrality. So the map of the subway presupposes at a very basic level its instrumental function. That is, it's a tool, and it's meant to be seen and used as such. It means to be, as Peter Turchi's phrase, transparently useful. Unlike their stone counterparts in ancient Babylon, our modern maps are less interested in defining where we are than suggesting how we'll get to the next place we're going. The visual logic is linear, not circular. So notice how the subway lines run from point to point in this map. What's really peripheral is not Brooklyn or New Jersey. It's the notion of staying put, of inhabiting any one place. If you were staying put, you wouldn't be using this map. This sort of map reveals us as a culture of travelers. Our purpose, if we have one, is transit, certainly not transformation. So it might seem like a stretch to be extrapolating values from a kind of ordinary map like this, but consider the fact that 4 million New Yorkers step onto one of these trains every day. And Google Maps boasts over 2 billion, with a B, monthly users. That's 25% of the world's population. These navigational tools are so embedded in the structure of our daily lives that we hardly notice how thoroughly they're shaping it. In Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari argues that our cultural myths are no longer carved into stone as they were in Mesopotamia. Instead, what he calls imagined orders, these are embedded in the material structure of our experience. So the money we exchange, the layout of our cities, the maps that direct our movements. We engage with these more frequently and less consciously than with any constitution or creation story. So their invisible assumptions become our unspoken beliefs. What I want to suggest, and what I try to help my students experience at HMI, is that linearity and instrumentality are biases of our culture, not facts of nature. So let me take you back outside to that nature. Imagine it's about 10 o'clock in the morning, southern Utah, mid-October. My students and I are taking a break along the rim of a canyon which slopes down 1,400 feet below us, so deep that the bottom of the canyon is still obscured in shadow. There's a slight breeze moving the needles of the pinyon pines and junipers. And there's one tiny cloud, almost totally hidden, perched on the horizon across the canyon. You can just almost see it there. The map we're holding tells us where we are and shows us where we're going, but it reveals almost nothing about the material fact of the canyon, the way our bodies will navigate the arrangement of rock directly below us. And just as that MTA map tells you basically nothing about what it's actually going to be like to ride a subway in New York City. So as we're standing on this canyon, my students are about to find out that there are no straight lines in the wilderness. At HMI, the routes we take through the mountains and deserts almost always involve some sort of loop. We do this in part for logistical reasons, because the bus we leave at the trailhead is the same bus that will get us home at the end of the trip. But there are also philosophical and pedagogical reasons to prefer a loop. As I stress to my students over and over again, no matter how far we walk, which route we choose, we'll end up exactly where we started from. The expedition is quite literally pointless. It is circular. I love this line from T.S. Eliot in Four Quartets. The end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. That's kind of what our expeditions are about. And the form of this experience runs counter to so much in the broader culture, with its emphasis on achievement and production and quantifiable value, in which linearity is assumed and we perceive ourselves as moving towards something. I know this is certainly true in my culture, and I'm making some assumptions, but consider for a moment just how embedded these assumptions about linearity, are in our very language that we use. In my political culture, for example, half of us call ourselves progressives. We praise technological advancement. We worry that we're behind on a project or celebrate moving ahead in our careers. We say that life is a journey and implicitly mean that where we start from is different from where we end up, that those are different points. I want to suggest that there's nothing natural about these biases. They're specific to our historical moment, our cultural moment, but they're so deeply entrenched in the way we think and speak and teach and perceive ourselves as to be effectively invisible. They form the worldview through which we understand ourselves and interact with our environment. An experience that can't be understood through this framework of progress might seem absurd or indulgent or even wasteful. Or it might feel radical in the original sense of that word, from the Latin radix or root. And at its root, in its most original form, our experience of the world is not actually linear. It's cyclical. The alternations of day and night, the changing of the seasons, plants die and return their nutrients to earth. The unlucky vole who gets eaten is transformed into the cells and muscle tissues of the owl who eats. Storm clouds steal moisture from the sea and relocate it inland, sourcing every creek and stream, puddle, river, and pool. I like to say that one function of experiential education is to facilitate encounters with the totally obvious, to notice where the rain comes from, to see how the sun moves across the sky in different seasons, to realize that we depend on those rivers and potholes to keep ourselves alive. And that just like the vole and the jackrabbit and the juniper tree, we will also end up as nutrients in the larger ecosystem in a very literal way. I like that root analogy too, because it underscores what I see as a fundamental difference between transit and transformation, the going and the growing, trying to get somewhere else versus getting to be wherever you are, just more deeply so, like roots reaching down through the soil. To return once again to my headlamp analogy, sometimes our knowing becomes its own sort of blindness. The circle of light on the ground ahead of us forms a circumference around what we're capable of seeing and perceiving and knowing. It isolates just one set of details amidst a whole landscape of potential details. Just as that subway map shows one method of moving through space while rendering all other routes invisible. We focus so much on what this worldview makes possible, how it makes the world visible and legible and navigable, that we forget what it leaves out. In her really wonderful 2005 book of essays, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, Rebecca Solnit says that one of the, quote, basic tactical questions of life is how to go about finding that thing, the nature of which is unknown to you. She goes on, the things we want are transformative, and we don't know or only think we know what is on the other side of that transformation. Love, wisdom, grace, inspiration. How do you go about finding these things that are in some ways about extending the boundaries of the self into unknown territory, about becoming someone else? Now, I would wager for you all, if you think about the really transformative experiences of your own life, that these are things you were not able to plan or predict in advance, that the way that those transformative events changed you, they didn't change you in the way that you had expected. Most of our prevailing models of education are kind of like that headlamp. They're incredibly useful tools for navigating in the darkness. But what if instead of always equipping with our students with bigger headlamps or brighter ones, we also valued the experience of being in darkness? Maybe we need, as a complement to all our maps and measurements and ways of knowing, an experience of encountering the world on its own terms. This would amount to, as Solnit writes, an art of recognizing the role of the unforeseen, of keeping your balance amid surprises, of collaborating with chance, of recognizing that there are some essential mysteries in the world, thereby a limit to calculation, to plan, and to control. That sort of education would require a much greater emphasis on direct experience. It would require that students trust their own senses as much as external authority. And paradoxically, it would mean knowing exactly where to look for the unknown. What are the edges of our worldview? How does the construction of knowledge create its own blind spots and blank spaces? How might such an encounter transform our relationship with what we do know? So, as I've said, maps externalize memory and knowledge and make that knowledge public. They turn subjective perception into an objective or apparently objective set of symbols. And it's worth lingering on this process for a moment. So, from an evolutionary perspective, the ability to represent and symbolize is, at least arguably, the feature of cognition that separates us from other animals, right? To abstract something away from its immediate physical context allows that thing to exist for us outside of time and space. When I say the word tree, for instance, you can picture both specific trees and also understand the general idea of treeness. You can imagine trees that have existed for you in the past and know where you would expect to find trees in the future. Maybe later this morning or afternoon if you leave the office or go for a walk. While these trees do exist in physical space, they also exist as abstractions in your mind. This is how language works. This is also how numbers work. They detach meaning from direct experience, allowing that experience to exist outside of us, representing it by a sound or a mark that can be understood by anyone who shares that same system of reference. Symbolic representation is what allows us to think, period, right? It's also what allows us to refer to the past, imagine the future, transmit ideas across generations, relate to the world even at a distance. And this is also how we know ourselves. When I say, I am Jacob, right, I am referring to a symbolic entity. What holds me together, what gives me coherence, is not so much biology as it is language. The cells that make up my skin and liver and bones are not the same cells that made up those things 2 decades ago. My name is a sort of symbolic shorthand that refers to my basic feeling of coherence, the sensation of my having existed and continuing to exist in space and time. It's a useful fiction for whenever I need a passport or want to open a bank account, but it is a fiction in the sense that my experience of being includes so much more than a name can convey. There's a gap between my sensation of aliveness and what I can say about it. This is, in short, the basic problem of language and also the basic problem of cartography. How can you represent a dynamic reality through a system of static symbols? How can you refer to something outside of time when to exist at all is to exist in time? This dilemma is inherent to the abstracting process, of course, but there's a more pertinent issue too. This is when symbolic approximations start to have a weight and shape in our minds, when they begin to seem more real to us than the things they were invented to represent. A menu is tremendously useful, in other words, but you mustn't confuse it with the meal. And if you ever walked into a restaurant where people were chewing and attempting to digest the paper upon which the menu was printed, you'd question their sanity. And yet this is not so far removed from our own situation. You know, I have a piece of paper written somewhere that says I have mastered certain forms of language. I write this on other pieces of paper whenever I'm applying for a job, and it has reality in the mind of the hiring manager who reads it. And it has a different sort of reality than the applicant who puts the letters PhD on their piece of paper. But PhD and MFA have no physical reality. You can't find them in our spleens or tucked away within the compartments of our brain. They describe, but they do not exist. In the same way that we use language to describe, we also use numerical values to order the world surrounding us. But numbers have no more reality than words do. In their 2025 book, The Blind Spot, physicists Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser, along with the philosopher Evan Thompson, argue that all of the mathematical and scientific systems we use to understand and represent the physical universe are inventions of human culture, which we have, over time, mistaken for features of that universe. They suggest that we've inadvertently replaced a concrete reality with an abstract one. Most of us subscribe to the belief, for instance, that our sensations of hot or cold are somehow less real than temperature as expressed through the number on a thermometer, or that the time we see on a clock is more trustworthy or definitive than our own subjective experience of duration. But neither time nor temperature exist in these particular forms except through the measurements that we have invented to express them. Things like frictionless planes, free-falling bodies, and absolute zero, all these things that you encounter in high school physics, they aren't physically real, right? They don't actually exist in space and time as we experience it. The authors remind us that these are fictional entities, useful only as approximations of the physical universe, because they have been so effective in getting us to the moon, enabling us to eradicate polio, and making it possible to communicate across the world instantaneously. We act as if they revealed reality in some absolute way. But they don't. They're descriptions of reality based on an invented scale. And there will always be a precision limit to what we can measure based on the tools we rely on to do the measuring. So if we return again to the American West, I want to consider the way that a particular history of cartography also reveals these limits of precision. So I lead 3 or 4 trips each year to southern Utah to a place called Bears Ears National Monument. It's one of the most spectacular landscapes on Earth, and actually the place I just came from. So this is a picture I took 2 days ago from Bears Ears. So as you can see, high desert, semi-arid pinyon and juniper forest, sandstone, and sagebrush. It's just north of the border with Arizona and east of where the Colorado River pools into Lake Powell behind Glen Canyon Dam. In the Permian period, 300 million years ago, this area was a giant dune system on the shores of a tropical sea, right? The sandstone literally just used to be sand. You can find fossils from that period embedded in the Cedar Mesa sandstone. And there are also thousands of these visual reminders, petroglyphs and pictographs and cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloan people who lived in the region until 800 years ago. It's one of the most remote landscapes in the United States, which means it was also one of the last regions to be explored and mapped by the US government. So here's one result of that mapping effort. This is a zoomed in version of the maps that we rely on during our expeditions at HMI. There are a couple things I want to draw your attention to, a few historical and scientific and philosophical considerations that I think are relevant. So we use what's called a 7.5-minute quadrangle, or a quad, produced by the US Geological Survey. It's at a scale of 1 to 24,000. So each centimeter on the map represents 240 meters in the actual landscape. The area corresponds to lines of latitude and longitude. Each minute of latitude, north and south, represents 1 nautical mile, about 1.85 kilometers. Latitude and longitude, or parallels and meridians, these have been around since before Ptolemy. They were invented to allow wayfinders and navigators to know where they were in relation to fixed points on the Earth's surface. And the formula to find your latitude in the northern hemisphere is actually pretty simple. So all you need to do is find Polaris if you go out at night, which is the North Star, and then calculate the angle of the star from the horizon. So it's really easy to do this at sea, harder to do so in a mountainous region. At the North Pole, Polaris is directly overhead, so the latitude is 90 degrees. At the equator, it would be 0 degrees. Our groups travel in Utah and Colorado between the 37th and 40th parallels. So you can see on the left side of this map, the 37. That's the mark of latitude. So longitude is a little bit different. These lines show the distance east and west from a kind of arbitrary prime meridian, and they bisect the north and south poles. They're not parallel. Because of the curvature of the Earth, the closer to the pole you get, the more compressed are the lines of longitude, meaning that the same 7.5-minute quad will show a different area depending on whether you're in southern Utah or southern Alaska. In other words, an apparently uniform approach to mapping using latitude and longitude yields different results based on where you're standing in the world. To project anything on a two-dimensional plane always involves a slight or sometimes significant distortion of reality. This is the inherent issue in global cartography. That's why Greenland and Canada look absolutely massive on the standard Mercator projection. To make a curved reality lie flat, you have to make decisions. What do you prioritize? Do you privilege angles, area, distance, or direction? Do you want your map to be accurate on a large scale, or do you want it to be useful on a small one? We inhabit a perceptual reality shaped by somewhat arbitrary decisions. Those decisions have very real political consequences. So the effort to map the entire United States actually began in the 1880s with a one-armed geologist and war veteran named John Wesley Powell. His goal was to survey the Western territories, to make possible the administration of public lands, and to have a full record of the region's mineral resources. This was kind of the dream of science, right? A comprehensive catalog of reality, one that would be useful to people, miners, settlers, scientists, explorers, and bureaucrats. Initially, the work was done by hand, and it's actually kind of incredible to imagine these USGS men standing out in fields, scaling cliffs, taking measurements, and collecting rock samples. The maps were revised throughout the 20th century as new technologies made measurement more precise. So this involved overlapping aerial photographs and eventually satellite data and software such as GIS. Produced maps of unbelievable sophistication. It took 100 years and 55,000 of those 7.5-minute maps. But by the early 1990s, the US Geological Survey had actually succeeded in mapping the entire country. So I've already mentioned the inherent distortion involved in mapping things at a large scale, what happens with longitude thanks to a curved planet. There's another issue, and a more practical one for us at the High Mountain Institute. This one has to do with mapping things on a microscale. So as you look at this map, you'll notice all sorts of lines and colors. And even without a key, I bet you can guess what most of these represent, right? The solid double black lines are maintained roads. The blue lines represent streams or drainages. In this case, it's the desert, so ephemeral streams. The green areas are forested. The white areas are less covered with vegetation. But the most important lines for navigation on a topographical map are these brown ones, the contour lines, because they represent topography. That is the vertical dimension of the landscape. So these lines kind of do the heavy lifting of this sort of cartography. And for someone who's never encountered a topographical map before, this isn't always intuitive. So each contour line represents a single elevation band. So if you imagine a bullseye drawn around the knuckle of your middle finger. So when you make a fist, you'll see that those rings would show a sort of elevation profile, and they never intersect. On our maps, each contour line represents 40 feet or 12 meters of elevation change. The closer the contour lines are to each other, the steeper the landscape. When they're spaced apart, you can anticipate flatter terrain. It's a wonderfully useful system in practice once you get the hang of it. But there's one issue, and the issue is that a lot can happen in 40 vertical feet between two contour lines. Just think of a telephone pole or a 4-story building. That's a lot of reality to disappear entirely thanks to this map scale. A slope that looks innocuous on the map might actually hide an impassable cliff band. Or else you might overlook an easy route because the contour lines can't show anything at a human scale. In practice, you can only be sure of a way in or out once you're staring right at it. So you may be seeing these old Ptolemaic maps with the words terra incognita or mare incognito written at the edges. These were the unknown lands and seas, the places where dragons and lions were thought to roam. And in spite of all the meticulous, comprehensive efforts to map the world and its continents, these blank spots never entirely left the map. They just migrated to the interior and have been hiding in plain sight ever since. This isn't a failure of the mapping process, but one of its features. And traveling through the landscape means confronting in a tactile, tangible way these blank spots and realizing the map's limitations. And speaking of limitations, maybe one way that we can tell an expert from a novice in a particular field is that experts understand the exact limits of their discipline. They work right at the edge of what's possible, what's knowable. They're familiar with where the blank spots are located. No one, for example, understands the limits of language and communication better than writers. The physicists working at the cutting edge of quantum research see how physical phenomena defy our best mathematical models. And as any Buddhist monk has grasped at an intuitive level, the self that is sitting for long hours in meditation is in some fundamental way an illusion. Because you see, the tools that allow us to practice our craft in the first place are also the very things that will get in our way once we've practiced it long enough. Our tools shape our worldview. They order our perception. They become the containers that allow us to hold something in mind by separating it out from its natural context. But you can never know the entire ocean when you're scooping it out in buckets that hold only a few liters at a time. So when my students arrive at HMI, they are beginners in reading maps. So naturally, they believe that our maps will be comprehensive and definitive. And they believe that until they start wandering into willow thickets and wading across rivers and walking to the very edge of cliffs that drop straight down. And they insist on the rightness of the route despite what they're seeing in front of them. And they get mad at the landscape for not conforming to the topography as it shows up on the map and the way they imagine it in their minds. But eventually, all the wrong turns that they make become their way of intuiting the right lesson. They learn that getting lost and turn around, that the landscape is richer and more varied and less knowable than the map had led them to believe. That's the lesson. My students experience directly in those 40-foot intervals between contour lines what can't be represented or mapped or measured. And they start to work with the landscape rather than against it. They start to search for easy passage based on how the rocks have eroded and the canyons have formed and the boulders have fallen. They realize that we are not separate from the landscape. Like the animals or the trees, we're also dependent on the little ephemeral pockets of water hidden in the desert. We are also influenced by the patterns of sun and shade, by the interplay of soil and slick rock. Given it enough time in the backcountry, even our conceptual and linguistic structures start to break down. What is organic and what's inorganic in this sort of landscape? What's alive and what isn't? Is the sandstone forming and eroding over the course of millennia more significant than the tadpole shrimp hatching for just a few hours inside a pool of rainwater carved from that same sandstone? Or is significance itself a way of separating and classifying and comparing things that fundamentally are not separate? In other words, are we describing what's there, or are we inventing what's there through our attempts to describe it? It's been said that human culture is only a few days thick, and I love that phrase. If our worldview is like a headlamp directing our attention to certain features in the landscape, separating what's central from what's peripheral, and shaping what we value by determining what we see, then the more time we spend in wild places, the more likely it is that our headlamps will run out of battery. And when they do, we'll start to understand that our tools are just tools. They're useful, but not necessary to our own lives or the lives going on all around us. And we'll realize in retrospect how much psychological energy we've devoted to our own illusions of control. And what are, anyway, the consequences of wanting to control something that lives? So, about 20 kilometers north of my home in Leadville, the South Fork of the Eagle River forms along the Continental Divide at Tennessee Pass. It gets larger from the snowmelt in the surrounding mountains and follows gravity northwest, then west through forested slopes and semi-desert shrublands for 100 kilometers, the landscape getting lower and drier all the while. Just before the border with Utah, the Eagle River drains into the Colorado River, which then winds southwest through the deep sandstone canyons of southern Utah. Below where the Colorado and Green Rivers meet in Canyonlands National Park, there's a 75-kilometer canyon called Cataract Canyon, full of massive rapids that drain into what is now known as Lake Powell. This is a man-made lake behind Glen Canyon Dam. And then below the dam, as the river continues into Arizona, it goes through the Grand Canyon, then west to the border with Nevada and California, and on, in theory, all the way to the sea. Much of the snow that I can see from my house ends up in this river system. And when we drive west from Leadville to southern Utah, we follow the course of the Colorado River almost the entire way. On the final morning of our expeditions, after we've returned to our buses, we cross a bridge over Glen Canyon and Lake Powell. And so as I start to wind this talk down, I want to return to this river and to John Wesley Powell, for whom Lake Powell is named. I've already mentioned him as the one-armed war veteran who advocated for mapping the entire United States. He was a geologist and one of the first directors of the U.S. Geological Survey, the group that produced those 7.5-minute quads. But Powell is perhaps most famous for another reason. In 1869, he set out to float more than 1,200 kilometers of the Colorado and its tributaries. His expedition consisted of 10 men and 4 wooden boats, kind of like what you see in this picture. And they were the first to ever attempt the journey of the river from its headwaters to where it lets out in the valley below the Grand Canyon. What's so compelling to me in the figure of Powell is that he contains these two contradictory impulses: the desire to see the world mapped, and at the same time, a willingness to trust completely in the unknown. He and his men were the first to see Cataract Canyon from river level, that infamous stretch of whitewater which runs through the heart of our expedition areas in southern Utah. And they were the first expedition to face the pounding of the rapids in the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, the place where the soft sedimentary rocks of Utah give way to the so-called basement rocks of Arizona. These are the hard, black, metamorphic rocks that were present at the formation of the North American continent nearly 2 billion years ago. The geologist Powell referred to the Grand Canyon as the library of the gods. The rock shelves, he would later write, formed the stony leaves of one great book. He who would read the language of the universe, wrote Powell, may dig out letters here and there and with them spell the words and read in a slow and imperfect way, but still so as to understand a little the story of creation. Significantly, in Powell's account, right, the language of the universe is not a human language. It can only be read imperfectly and understood a little. Over and over again, the men of the Powell expedition were confronted with natural forces so ancient and implacable, so beyond the understanding and control of human beings, that all they could do was trust their fate to the course of the river. As they approached the inner gorge of the Grand Canyon, Powell marked the moment with the following words: "We have an unknown distance yet to run, an unknown river to explore. What falls there are, we know not. What rocks that beset the channel, we know not. What walls ride over the river, we know not. We must run the rapids, or else abandon the river." To calculate on the unforeseen, writes Rebecca Solnit, is perhaps exactly the paradoxical operation that life most requires of us. To row willingly into an unmapped river, to walk through the darkness without a headlamp, to keep your balance as the details of the landscape take you by surprise. This is what I mean by experiential education. This is what calculating on the unforeseen looks like in practice. And notice how paddling downriver into the unknown is exactly the opposite of someone driving directly into a snowbank. Powell accepted the uncertainty, and he wagered his life that he could navigate the unknown stretches of river below him. That guy driving up Mosquito Pass assumed certainty. He blindly trusted the authority of an algorithm, failed to adapt when the conditions on the ground contradicted that authority. Blank spots are a feature of our human world. The question is, will we trust in what we don't know or cling to what we do? And I actually think a lot hinges on that choice. We've tried, as a species, certainty, power, control, faith in our own prowess. We've invented atomic weapons, carried out inquisitions and holocausts, put a price tag on the whole world. But we're also still here, incredibly, inexplicably, against all odds. And despite all of the horror and darkness and evil, don't we continue to surprise ourselves? Doesn't the natural world still catch us off guard? Whatever hope I have for the future is a hope in continuing to be surprised. Because here are two controversial but related claims. I truly believe that we're only capable of loving what we can't entirely control or predict. And this is as true of a passage of Shakespeare as it is of a romantic partner or that place that you pictured at the start of this talk. And here's my other claim: to know something or to think we know something completely is to kill it. Because to know is to fix a living thing into a form that we can use. It's to reduce a complex system into separate parts and to stop time. Let me illustrate this a little bit more concretely. Before floating through the Grand Canyon, the Powell expedition ran the cataracts of the Colorado River through Glen Canyon. Nearly all the trips I lead in southern Utah through Dark Canyon and Grand Gulch, White Canyon, and Slickhorn Canyon, these are all connected through drainages to this section of the Colorado River. It is, or was, a wild and spectacular place. Now, I put that in the past tense because the exploration of the Colorado that began with Powell and continued with the mapping of the entire region turned the living river into an abstract resource. And to make a long story short, it led to the damming of Glen Canyon and the drowning of an entire ecosystem to support human development in places like Las Vegas and Phoenix in Southern California, none of which can exist in their current capacities except for the water supplied by the river. Actually, 1 in 10 Americans rely on the Colorado for their drinking water. Here's how Powell described their initial descent. Quote, "We decided to call it Glen Canyon. Past these towering monuments, past these mounded billows of orange sandstone, past these oak-set glens, past these fern-decked alcoves, past these mural curves, we glide hour after hour, stopping now and then as our attention is arrested by some new wonder. It is a land of beauty and glory." Notice the syntax there. Their attention is arrested by some new wonder. They're not directing that attention like the beam of a headlamp. It is being arrested by the landscape around them. Those who saw it up close invariably described Glen Canyon as a portion of Earth's original paradise. So this photo is one of the side canyons that the Powell expedition explored, and you can see from the figures in the background kind of the scale of this. And here's what the river looks like today. The dam is no doubt a serious feat of human ingenuity. Its intention was to harness and control the flow of a wild river so as to provide water uninterrupted to the cities downstream. In doing so, the dam destroyed habitat for hundreds of different species and buried thousands of indigenous artifacts and ruins. Each year, the reservoir accumulates 100 million tons of sediment from upstream, thereby reducing its storage capacity. And since its opening in 1963, Lake Powell has lost more than 30 million acre-feet of water to evaporation, which is 2 to 3 times the entire annual flow of the Colorado River system. But these are just numbers, and my whole point is that we can't fully quantify or measure the aliveness of a living system. The great irony in naming this reservoir Lake Powell is that John Wesley Powell himself knew the dangers of trying to make the landscape fit the human imagination. In the 1890s, Powell argued before Congress that the arid American West should not be organized along arbitrary political boundaries, but based on watersheds. Natural limitations in rainfall meant that the West couldn't sustain urban development in the way that the eastern side of the continent had. He advocated for local decision-making and development that matched the carrying capacity of the land. But Powell was overruled by congressmen and boosters who thought the terrain could conform to the maps they'd already imagined and drawn up for it. Instead of being understood as a living system, water was perceived as a resource, a thing to be managed for the benefit of human populations. Ironically, in treating the river as if it were a predictable resource, the great cities of the Southwest have made themselves completely dependent on the administration of its flow. And now these population centers find themselves in a much more precarious situation, environmentally and politically, than they would have been simply adopting a lifestyle to suit the natural variations of the system. So where does this all leave us? I certainly don't think there are any sort of pedagogical silver bullets. My interest, as is hopefully clear by now, has to do with orientation and perception, the way we're oriented to ourselves, each other, and the natural world, who and what we choose to trust and value, how we construct, maintain, and get free of our particular worldviews. And so I'll leave you with 2 unusual, but I think useful pieces of advice for practicing the sort of orientation I've described this morning. The first is to make friends with a tree, and the second is to understand the difference between maps and metaphors. So there's an old saying that describes someone who's fixated on minutia rather than seeing the big picture. We say that this person can't see the forest for the trees. I think that our issue is generally the opposite, right? We're so used to thinking in terms of abstract forests that we lose sight of actual trees. And not just trees, but anything that is too finely grained to show up on our maps of reality. So here's one assignment I actually give to my students. Attend to something in the organic world around you for an extended period of time, ideally a few minutes every day or every week for a year. Develop a relationship with whatever you choose, whether it's a tree or a shrub or a stream or a patch of grass. And the more ordinary, the better. There's this wonderful scene in the Wim Wenders film, Perfect Days, of this guy who cleans toilets in Tokyo. Every lunch, he takes his lunch break in this park and looks up and takes pictures of the same trees. That's exactly what I'm suggesting. So see how open and receptive you can be to what it is that you're looking at and what it has to teach you. Consider the ways that this object, I use that in quotes, is alive to its environment, how it influences and is influenced by the other organisms around it. Consider how it lives, how it will die, and also think about the different perceptual, linguistic, and philosophical frameworks that get in the way of your meeting it as an equal. Now, you don't need to write about this or produce anything or share your observations with anyone. In fact, it's better if you don't. And I won't spoil the fun, but my hunch is that if you do this, if you're willing to encounter the material world directly on its own terms without trying to make anything out of it, you'll start to recalibrate your sense of scale and perspective. You'll be surprised at how vivid and alive it is, this ordinary organism. I actually think the process and the practice will change you. And every tree and patch of grass in the world is like this. Your relationship with the one organism becomes, as you'll see, a metaphor for your relationship with the rest of the world. Which brings me to my second piece of advice, which is to pay attention to the difference between maps and metaphors. Now, I've defined maps, and I'll define metaphor as most basically a way of describing something in terms of another thing. Generally, it involves a comparison between something abstract and something concrete, an idea and an image. If I were to say, for example, in a classic example, my love is like a red, red rose, then you would understand that the qualities of my love are to be understood through the qualities that you associate with a rose. Its fragrance and vivid color, its fragility, its soft petals, and maybe also the danger of the thorns all along the rose's stem, right? You are taking the experience of roses that you have had and applying them to this linguistic construct. Now, in some ways, the map is a kind of metaphor for the train. It describes one thing in terms of another thing, translating the reality of a living system into a symbolic system of distances and elevations and color. The map orders the landscape and makes it comprehensible to us through the logic of language and measurement. It says, here is reality, the reality of a place in miniature, the scale of 1 to 24,000. But in another important sense, maps and metaphors work in opposite directions. The map takes concrete, tangible reality and reduces it to abstraction. It simplifies a complex system. The metaphor takes an abstraction, love, and links it to the tangible world. It gives an idea or concept or emotion a perceptible form. So speaking of love, the love that Achilles has for Patroclus in the Iliad is very different from the love that Anna Karenina has for Count Vronsky in Tolstoy's story. The stories themselves exist to dramatize these differences through metaphor by making these different types of love concrete. And also, these stories are made real through our imaginative participation. Whenever you read a poem or a novel, you are translating a linguistic construct into a felt sensation. You are reclaiming a public language through your own private experience of that language. Good stories make the world more rather than less real to us because we experience them in our bodies, not just in our minds. And here's another crucial distinction. Metaphors don't explain, they suggest. Whereas an explanation shrinks the world to the level of the intellect, a suggestion expands the world through imagination. It's no coincidence that all great spiritual teachers speak in parables, while churches traffic in doctrines and creeds and codes. Or consider how poets and lawyers differ in the way they work with words. The language is the same, the words are the same, but the relationship is totally different. We need both, of course, poets and lawyers, scientists and storytellers. It's just that poems and stories and parables return language to its origins in the material world, the world we experience in our bodies and through our senses. If maps and abstractions are useful for predicting and explaining and helping us travel from here to there, then metaphors do a different kind of work. They remind us of the space we exist in already. They teach us how to arrive where we already are. And that's what we've really been doing this morning, working with metaphor. When I asked you at the outset to imagine a place you loved, I was really asking you to build an imaginative bridge between something tangible and something that resists expression. You were using the concrete details of a particular place, its light and weather, the objects it contains, the way it seems solid underfoot, to make contact with an otherwise intangible emotion, what it actually feels like inside of you to love. If a map tries to erase all evidence of subjectivity, then to tell a story, however imperfectly, is to insist on the fundamental connection between what we carry inside of us and the world outside. It's to refuse separation. When we're telling a story, we're not just talking about the world, we're participating in it. We are actually behaving ecologically. We are imagining ourselves as part of the ecosystem. And so, as far as forms of knowledge go, I think that is a pretty promising direction. And that's what I've got. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have one question, I feel like, already in the chat. So you have 2 seconds when I ask him to rest. Do these poetic reflections resonate with other local people as well, including indigenous communities? And also, this is the second part of the questions from Nevenka. What do participants or students, your students, gain from these experiences? Something new and enjoyable, new skills, a sense of inner peace, or something else? And do you see any changes in their behavior after this? This was from Nevenka.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for the questions, deep questions. I not being Indigenous myself, I can't fully speak that, but in my English class, we look at some Puebloan literature. And at the foundation of that literature is this belief that stories and landscapes are interrelated, that every landscape exists in story and every story exists in landscape, and that stories are told communally through the experience of landscape. So for Indigenous people in this region, it's very important to be connected to the landscape through story, and that is their relationship to the landscape. There's a wonderful writer, Leslie Marmon Silka, who I would recommend her novel Ceremony. And she's also got this wonderful essay, Landscape History in the Pueblo Imagination, where she talks exactly about this relationship between the stories we tell and the landscapes that we encounter. And I would say, a further thing to think about is that their linguistic structures are different than Western English linguistic structures. I put object in air quotes when I was describing a tree, because in Indigenous languages, they don't relate to the natural world as objects. This is explored in Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, which is a really wonderful thing. She calls it the grammar of animacy, and how in Indigenous languages, The relationship between humans and the natural world is not divided into subject and object the way that a lot of Western alphabetic languages are. So there's a whole world that you can go into in terms of indigenous knowledge in these places. I will say, just for our students, the thing I think they take away from it is that they learn to start trusting their intuition more so than the knowledge they're presented, as I've been talking about a little bit. But their relationship to the landscape changes. I think they become advocates of environmental preservation. They become invested in the fate of the landscape because they start to see themselves as part of that landscape. And we see that with the students who come back after years. We've had reunions every 5 years, and I was talking to students who were in the first semester at HMI, and so many of them, they feel like their lives were transformed in a way that pushed them into careers that have something to do with the natural world. And I think it's because they learned to love that landscape by being in it, by sharing it with others and telling stories about it. So I think it does have a tangible impact for them.
Thank you. Also, Nevenka is thanking you. She was reminded about also the difference in Slovenian language from English, which is the dual number, which I guess is very important when you're relating to things, because it's, is it a group of us or is it the two of us?
Yeah.
Any other questions, guys? You can also speak up. Okay. No, you were stunned. I do. I have one question. You showed very well how these abstractions or symbols pull us in very well. So we don't really, we lose sight of what's around us, maybe. And I feel that's especially visible in institutions. So working in yes, systems, man-made systems, symbolic ones especially. Do you have any tips for not being too caught up in these symbolic systems when you are dealing, when you are actually living inside of them? I think you used the word, wait, I wrote it down. Yeah, you said refuse separation, right? Of the world, but I think a lot of things are very separated. And if you're incorporated in this, it's very difficult. So if you have any thoughts on this.
You know, one of the thought experiments I like to play with students is where is HMI? Where does that exist? Is it the classrooms? Is it the campus? Is it the teachers you have here? Is it the students? And of course, if you play that game, you know, you go back and it doesn't really exist in any physical space. You can do this with so many different things, you know, the self. And I think this is where Harari is really good about that idea of the imagined reality. HMI, any institution, is something that we collectively imagine together, and it has reality as long as we continue to collectively imagine it. And so I think one of the things that I think about my work is that that's a useful thing, right? The mission statement of an organization is good for defining what we're about and what sort of work we're doing, but it doesn't actually help me working with a student. And when I'm with a student or in a class or in the backcountry, it helps to return to the immediacy of that interaction and remember that, you know, when I say we're not separate, I mean that in literal and metaphorical ways. Like if that person is not doing well, or they're upset, or they're going through some sort of crisis, that impacts me as well, right? My own being is influenced by my relationship to that person and the way they're showing up in this space. So in taking time to help them or process something, or, you know, they run out of water on the trail and I give them some of mine, it's not like I'm sacrificing my water for their benefit. It's like we're a mutual system here. So I think every moment I can find to remember that there's that imagined order that is kind of directing us, but there are these concrete, tangible ways which we are related to each other in very real moments. Those are the things that I think are really special, and I think that's, you know, that's where I do learning that is so impactful for me in my life and that I carry with me, reminding myself that.